Good afternoon, everybody. My name is JP Tasker with CBC News. I'll be the moderator for today's press conference. Today we have Garnett Genuis, the Conservative Shadow Minister for International Development, Conservative Senator Leo Housakos. We have NBA free agent and world-renowned human rights fighter Enes Kanter Freedom. And Sarah Teich is also here to discuss a ban on goods made with forced labor from the Xinjiang region of China. Take it away, please.
Thank you all for coming, and those of you who are joining virtually, merci pour votre présence ici aujourd'hui. L'année dernière, la Chambre des communes a adopté une motion de l'opposition reconnaissant le génocide perpétré par le Parti communiste chinois dans la région de Xinjiang, commis par la seule raison que les populations originaires de ces régions sont musulmans. Uyghur men, women, and children are being raped, tortured, and murdered because they're Muslim. Unfortunately, an identical motion recognizing the Uyghur genocide was defeated in the Senate shortly thereafter. However, that motion in the Senate did grab the attention of someone who has been an incredible and vocal opponent and critic of the communist regime of China. He is someone who has used this high profile to call them out, as well as calling out those of us in the West who are complicit in their human rights abuses through our own inaction. I'm talking about our very special guest here on stage with us, Mr. Enes Kanter Freedom. And you will be hearing from Mr. Freedom in a moment. We're also joined today by Ms. Sarah Teich. Ms. Teich is an international human rights lawyer and senior fellow at the Macdonald Laurier Institute. She was lead counsel for the Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project when they were granted intervener status in last year's court case with the federal government over the CBSA's refusal to block imports from Xinjiang region in accordance with our obligation under the Canada-US-Mexico Free Trade Agreement. Mr. Freedom has been fearless over the past several years as he has taken on the NBA, companies like Nike, and megastars like LeBron James for continuing to aid and abet China's genocidal regime. And when he reached out to me and asked if there was anything he can do to help our efforts here in Parliament, I happily said yes. So that's what brings us here today. Integrated with this genocide in Xinjiang is undeniable evidence that up to 1 million members of the Uyghur minority continue to be victims of forced labor for the benefit of the communist authorities and for the benefit of businesses that are implicated in this activity. And while the United States is preparing to bring into force later this month a law banning all imports from Xinjiang region, here in Canada we have stopped not one container of goods from that region, not a single one. The only one that had been stopped has since been released to the importer. Selon moi et selon mes invités, si je peux me permettre de parler brièvement à leur nom, l'inaction de notre gouvernement pour empêcher l'entrée de produits issus du travail forcé sur le marché canadien, voire notre action en tant que consommateurs pour acheter ces produits, signifie que nous sommes complices dans l'une des plus grandes violations des droits humains de notre époque. And that's why we invite Mr. Freedom to be here with us today, to draw attention to and support our efforts, like Bill S-204, to have the Trudeau government ban the import of all goods from the Xinjiang region. With that, I turn the microphone over to my friend and colleague, MP Garnett Genuis, for a few words, who, of course, all of you know, has been a strong advocate and supporter of what is right and just.
Thank you so much, Senator Housakos. Thank you to all the members of the media for being here. It's a great pleasure for me to be part of this press conference to welcome Mr. Kanter Freedom to Parliament Hill. Mr. Kanter Freedom, you have such an important platform, and you've chosen to use that platform for good, and to be a voice for those who don't have the same platform, for those victims who have stories to tell but can't get their stories heard. You are using your platform to magnify their pain, their suffering, and their stories to call for global action. And I want to salute you for being here and for doing that. Mr. Kanter Freedom is a Nobel Peace Prize nominee. He's a recipient of the Geneva Summit's 2022 award. He's done so much work on Uyghur rights and so many other important issues. And I was sharing with him just prior to this press conference that we've got this this strange reality in Canada where we have had, I think, a lot of effective cross-party work and leadership from within Parliament, and yet the government has lagged behind in terms of taking the actions that are required at a government level. We had a unanimous motion in Parliament recognizing the Uyghur genocide. Everybody who voted in favor of that motion, and we were the first Parliament in the world to recognize the Uyghur genocide, and of course other parliaments followed. So at the level of the House of Commons stepping up and taking action, we've seen important action. But the government of Canada, the government has yet to recognize this genocide and take some of the important follow-up actions that flow from our obligations under the Genocide Convention, and we need to see those actions. There is a cross-party push to see, yes, stronger legislation to combat the importation of products made through slave labor, and yet we need to see a regional approach as well that recognizes the specific issue of forced labor in East Turkestan, and I'm very supportive of the measure that my colleague Senator Housakos has talked about. So we need to go further, and we need to have effective enforcement from the government of the existing provisions that are in place. And as was mentioned, there was I think one shipment stopped and then released. So we've clearly not seen the effective action that we need to see. A couple other issues I want to identify in this area. I'm very pleased that the Special Committee on Canada-China Relations is going to be getting back to work soon. That will be another important forum for putting forward these issues of human rights in China. And we have a private member's bill working its way through the system on forced organ harvesting and trafficking. We're seeing increasingly that Uyghurs are victims of forced organ harvesting and trafficking. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to pass that legislation. Senator Ratulajan Prosen in the Senate, I'm the sponsor of it in the House of Commons. Another important initiative to move forward on justice and human rights issues and to stand with Uyghur victims of these human rights violations. Without any further ado, Mr. Kanter Freedom, thank you so much for being here, and I'll turn it over to you to share your important message.
Yeah, of course. First of all, thank you guys for having me. It's an honor, and I'm humbled to be here. Thank you, Senator, and thank you, everyone, to be here. I want to tell you guys about how I actually started to, get into this, Uyghur topic. The last 8-9 years, I was talking about the problems that are happening in my home country, Turkey. And unfortunately, you see there is no, democracy, freedom of religion, speech, or expression, or, there is no human rights in Turkey. So I was focusing on the problems that were happening in Turkey. And, just last summer, I was on a basketball camp for kids in New York. And I remember, after the camp, it was a beautiful camp. And after the camp, all the kids were lined up. They were taking pictures and getting autographs one by one. And I took a picture with this kid, and his parent was taking a video. And he pretty much called me out in front of everybody. There were kids there, media, people, and some of my friends. And he said, "How can you call yourself a human rights activist when your Muslim brothers and sisters are getting tortured and raped every day in concentration camps in China?" I was shocked. I didn't know what to say. I turned around to that parent. The first thing I said was, "I promise I'm going to get back to you." So that day I canceled everything. I went back to my hotel and I started to study about what's going on. Because the last 8 years I was so focused on the problems that were happening in Turkey because my family was stuck there, and there were so many political prisoners and innocents are being suffered in Turkey because of the Erdogan regime. So I started to study about what is happening to the Uyghur people. And what I learned, it broke my heart. I was very ashamed with myself. I was like, I cannot believe the last 8-9 years I was focusing on the only one dictatorship. And I immediately called my manager, and I told him I need to speak to someone who's been in concentration camp before. Because on internet, you're going to find every kind of news. So I wanted to hear from the first hand. And I remember sitting down and having a conversation with her. And the things that, she told me, I just couldn't believe it. And she was telling me about, the forced, sterilization and abortion, and she was telling me about the gang rape and torture. And I don't want to go into too much details, but it shattered my heart, and I was very ashamed with myself. End of the conversation, I asked her, "What can I do for you?" She said, "Nothing." I was like, "What do you mean nothing?" She said, "I'm good. I'm in America, but there are millions of people in concentration camps that are getting tortured and raped every day. Help those people, not me." And after I, heard that, my heart even shattered even more. So I started to talk about the problems that are happening over there in China, and they were, it just, I wanted actually not just talk about it, but educate my teammates about it. And obviously, when the topic is China, unfortunately, many of my colleagues were scared to say a word about it. And I was waiting for someone to just help me, And I remember my manager sending me the tweet of Senator, and it gave me so much hope. When I saw that tweet, it gave me so much motivation. I was like, wow, I am not alone in this. I know he's not an NBA player, but I was like, this is amazing when I see a brave people coming out and talking about the problems that are happening there. So I was like, let's reach out to him. So we reached out to him. I immediately asked, I want to help. What can we do together? Because we always say, don't just talk about it, be about it. So when I saw Senator's tweet, I was like, here's someone that I can just work with and just bring some real change. And, I called him a month ago. I was like, I want to come to America. I want to come to Canada and sit down and see what can we do together to help those innocent people over there. And here's a beautiful bill. I read it and I'm supporting 100%. But people needs to understand there are so many human rights violations that are happening over there in China, and many countries call it, and I agree to genocide. So we have to call it like it is, and we have to do whatever we can to help those innocent people over there. And sometimes the things that you talk about can cost a lot. You have to make some sacrifices. But when I heard the stories of Uyghur people, I have no regrets. So it's an amazing opportunity to bring even more awareness. Like I said again, when I work with or when I see the brave people like this, it gives me so much hope and motivation to fight for what's right. So I never regret my decision, and I'm glad that I'm reached out and see what can we do together. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Freedom. Sarah, do you have something to add? Sarah Teich, of course, you have the floor.
Sure. I just want to put this forced labor issue in context a little bit, because there's so much evidence that forced labor is pervasive in the Uyghur region. And there have been growing reports on exactly what's happening and just how many multinational corporations are implicated. In 2020, the Australia Strategic Policy Institute came out and named 82 global brands that have Uyghur forced labor in their supply chains. This spans numerous industries, and the Coalition to End Uyghur Forced Labor estimates that 1 in 5 products are tainted by Uyghur forced labor. So this is a massive issue. And in terms of why we should care and why Canada needs to get involved, it's not just a moral issue, which of course it is, as Mr. Freedom so rightly pointed out. It's also a legal issue. Canada has ratified numerous international treaties that impose upon it international legal obligations to effectively suppress forced labor and clean up supply chains. And Canada is also a party to the Genocide Convention, which means that Canada doesn't just have an obligation to not commit genocide. Canada also has an obligation to prevent genocide. So I just wanted to flag also that this is not something nice that we just should do. This is something that we really do need to act on. Thanks.
Okay, thank you all. Let's turn now to the question and answer portion of our afternoon. So we'll start in the room and then we'll move to Zoom. If anybody is on Zoom and would like to ask a question, please use the raise hand function on the system there, and we'll get to you after we work through the people who are sitting in front of me now. Catherine Cullen with CBC News, please.
I will ask a question about the legislation to our lawmakers in a minute, but maybe first for both of you, I could just ask a bit of a big picture question. if you were to go out and ask anyone on the street, of course, they would say they don't want forced labor involved in our products. Why do you think there is such a disconnect between what the average person would say that they want and what actually happens?
I actually gave a lecture just last night to a group of Carleton University students. And something that came up in that lecture was, these students were very interested in this issue. That's why they were there. But they didn't know how many brands were involved. And when I dropped names like Nike and Zara, there was shock around the room. And the girls were, lamenting that they couldn't buy Zara clothes anymore. And I think there's so many. 82 named by ASPE. More named by Laura Murphy in her recent report that came out just a couple months ago, that it's hard to keep track. So, I think the scale of it is probably a large part of that.
I agree 100%. There are 82 companies who's been involved with that, forced labor. But, we just have to call out those companies. First of all, I'm gonna get to that. But, you see there are many companies out there who are standing for the things that they believe in America. I live in America, so I'm going to give an example from America, like Nike. It's the biggest sponsor of NBA, so I'm going to give an example of Nike. But you're looking at Nike, they stand up for, the Latino community, LGBTQ community. They stand up for, Black Lives Matter, no Asian hate. But unfortunately, when it comes to, China, they remain in silence. So we have to call them like it is. And I think that I agree 100% of what she says.
For both of maybe I'll start with you, Senator Housakos. You know certainly that Minister O'Regan has embraced Senator Meeville-Deschênes' legislation. What would you like to see in terms of changes to that legislation as it goes through to committee to give it the kind of teeth that you're hoping for?
That's a very good piece of legislation, which I supported in the Senate, and I'm glad the government's embracing it. I think this is just one first step towards sending a clear message to nations that infringe upon human rights, that we will not deal with them unless they align themselves on some of the fundamental values and principles that we Canadians hold dear. And back to your question that you asked originally, which I think is a fundamental question, I think the issue is greed. Very often it's greed that drives complacency on the part of our constituents, and greed that drives participation in this deplorable acts on the part of some of our corporations. And I think we need to do a better job, and that's why Mr. Freedom is here today, and try to sensitize Canadians that every time you buy a piece of clothing, that you should look into where it comes from and who's actually sweated and toiled in order to produce that, and at what price are you willing to sacrifice values and human rights for your own economic benefit.
The takeaway in terms of what legislators could be doing further.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm very supportive of S211. I spoke on the bill in the House, and I made some suggestions around amendments, and I look forward to our Foreign Affairs Committee in the House being able to review it, and there's important work happening there. But S211 is about creating a reporting mechanisms that facilitate the public holding companies accountable. It is not about taking a regional approach to particular hotspots and saying, we know that there is a large volume of forced labor happening in these places, and therefore we have to treat those places differently. So it's a different framework that I think we need in addition to the framework provided by S211. And I would go further and say it makes sense to just in general have legislation that recognizes that there are always, hopefully not always, but for the foreseeable future, there's going to be particular regions of the world where there's a much higher risk of forced labor. So we have to take an approach that treats those areas differently. And the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act of the United States does this. It's a bipartisan piece of legislation in the United States. So S211 is good, but the kind of legislation that Senator Housakos has put forward is very important as well. And on the main theme, I'll just say I think often of that quote from William Wilberforce, a champion of abolition in the British Parliament centuries ago, who said, after exposing information, he would say, "You may choose to look away, but you may never again say that you did not know." When so many of us are seeing constantly products in the store that have forced labor, Uyghur forced labor in particular, as part of their supply chains, it is so much easier to look away and say, in principle, I'm against forced labor, but I also really want to buy this product, or for investors, for the government to say, well, we'll just look the other way. So the importance of the awareness raising work that Mr. Kanter Freedom and others are doing is to make sure people can't ever say they don't know. To make sure people know, and it's ultimately up to them to make the choice about what they do. But as Wilberforce said, once you know, you can still choose to look away, but you can never say again that you didn't know. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Next we have Ellie Canton-Nantel from True North. Go ahead.
Yes, hello. My question is for Mr. Kanter. North Korean SKP and human rights activist Yeonmi Park spoke in Ottawa last month, and she said that she found Justin Trudeau's praise of China to be disgusting. Trudeau previously said he admired China's basic dictatorship, and he refused to vote to declare China's treatment of the Uyghurs a genocide. What do you make of the fact that the head of a Western democratic nation like Canada isn't willing to denounce China's abuse at the fullest extent?
Unacceptable. I think we need to, whoever it is, we need to call them out and hold them accountable. You see right now China is, while we're talking right now, there's a genocide happening, and not just Uyghurs. You look at Tibetans and Hong Kongers and what Mongolians are going through, and you look at Taiwan, right? And it's the biggest human rights violations that are happening in the world right now. And I think, I think we just need to hold them accountable. And then by him saying that, I'm just not accepting it. I feel like we need to put more pressure on those, Western leaders or whoever it is, any politician that doing some kind of work with China, to just hold them accountable, because there are so many people over there that are suffering, and we're talking about human rights, and human rights is about politics. So just because of economies involved, just because of money and business involved, we need to call them out like it is. So.
Right, my other question is for both MP Genuis and Senator Housakos. So the world reacted pretty quickly to punish Russia following its invasion of Ukraine. Yet communist China, which engages in genocide and religious persecution, it's responsible for a global pandemic that has killed over 6 million people. It has also trampled on the rights of Hong Kongers, as you mentioned, people of Tibet, and also threatens Taiwan and its independence. They've also put their own citizens in places like Shanghai through really abusive lockdowns. So they remain mostly unchecked and unsanctioned. Why do you think world leaders who were quick to hold Russia accountable do not seem to want to take the same action to punish China for its behavior?
Yeah, it's an important question. What we are seeing very clearly in China is grotesque violations of human rights, but also violations of international law. China's commitments, for instance, with respect to the unique status of Hong Kong, have been totally ignored. So I think for some world leaders, perhaps they see the invasion of Ukraine as being kind of different from what China's doing because it involves the transgression of an international boundary. But China is already violating its own commitments, violating international law in its treatment of Hong Kong, obviously, and it's violating its international obligations with respect to the human rights of its own people. So I do think that although there are a lot of details about those two circumstances that are different, that it's critically important that we hold the leaders of both Russia and China accountable for their violations of international law and their violations of human rights. It's hard for me to speculate about the motivations of individual leaders. I mean, obviously, China is a is a larger player economically and in terms of its integration within the global system. But I think it's a clear principle of international human rights that we not let anybody get away with the kind of behavior that we're seeing. And the response, in addition to the things we've talked about already today, is targeted sanctions against those involved in violations of human rights. We have the Magnitsky Act now. It's an important tool for targeting human rights abusers. And we have continuously called for the Magnitsky Act to be used more to target violators of human rights. It's a very effective tool for holding individuals accountable for those violations. We've called for its use against officials involved in the repression in East Turkestan, in Hong Kong, and elsewhere. Although in the end, after much conservative pressure, the government supported the Magnitsky Act legislation. They've been very reluctant to use it. And again, the Magnitsky Act was a great legislative initiative that came from conservative senators, and so another example of the great work that our Senate colleagues are doing on human rights issues, and hopefully we'll see more of that legislation, such as Senator Housakos' bill passed, to continue to move these things forward.
Thank you for your question. I'm going to be very blunt. I think the bottom line is we have some large, powerful corporations in the Western democratic world that are making a lot of money in China. And those corporations have an extraordinary amount of influence on our governments right across the G7. It's a sad reality, and that's what it is. And that's the discrepancy between why they take certain actions, because obviously Russia doesn't have that degree of influence. So we need to start more and more sensitizing our public in the Western world. Canada is a powerful G7 country, one of the biggest middle-class markets, and understand that there should be it's a privilege when countries like China have unfettered access to our large, middle-class, powerful market. And they have to align themselves vis-a-vis human rights and democracy and freedom to where we are, and rule of law. And if they don't, they shouldn't have access to that marketplace. And that's why my bill S-204 is so unequivocal, that any product that comes in from Xinjiang doesn't come in here. And we shouldn't be, the onus shouldn't be on CBSA to figure out, is there one container out of 50 that is legitimate? It's like the message should be unequivocal and clear. Get your act together, align yourselves with what is important to us, or you don't have access to our marketplace, period.
Thank you, Senator. Do either of you have another question? We do have some more time. If not, that's totally fine. But no, okay. And there's nobody else on Zoom, so that concludes today's press conference. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Have a good rest of your day.